The morning of August 29th, 1944, Route Nationale 7, northern France, a German reconnaissance patrol, hidden in a roadside tree line, watches something that defies every assumption they hold about modern warfare. For the past 72 hours, they have been observing what appears to be an endless river of trucks flowing eastward, marked with distinctive red balls painted on their sides. The convoy has not stopped, not for night, not for rest, not for anything. The patrol leader, Hauptmann Wilhelm Krause, lowers his field glasses and checks his tally marks for the third time this morning. In the previous 24 hours alone, his team has counted over 900 trucks passing this single point. Each truck carries approximately 5 tons of supplies. The mathematics are simple, yet impossible. This one convoy route is delivering more tonnage per day than his entire army group receives through all sources combined. Truck, rail, and horse-drawn transport. Krause had served in Poland, France, and Russia. He had witnessed the Wehrmacht at the height of its power, had seen German logistics support the greatest military advances in modern history. But this was something entirely different. This represented a form of military power that Germany had no counter for, no experience with, no doctrine to address. This was not just superior logistics. This was proof that the Americans had transformed supply chain management into a strategic weapon more devastating than any tank or aircraft. The question that would haunt German military analysts for the remainder of the war crystallized in that moment, watching those trucks roll past in seemingly infinite numbers. How does an army fight an enemy whose supply convoys alone exceed your entire military's logistical capacity? The answer, as German intelligence would painfully document over the coming months, was that you cannot. The Americans were not just winning through battlefield tactics or superior weapons, they were winning through industrial organization so efficient, so massive, so relentlessly effective, that German forces were being buried under an avalanche of American material superiority. The story of how this happened, how young American truck drivers, many of them African-American soldiers facing discrimination even while serving their nation, created the most successful military logistics operation in history, reveals fundamental truths about modern warfare that remain relevant 8 decades later. This is the story of the Red Ball Express, and how American trucks rolling through France proved that in industrial warfare, supply sergeants win battles as decisively as combat generals. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The foundation of this unprecedented logistics achievement was laid not in August 1944 when the Red Ball Express began operations, but months earlier, during the most ambitious amphibious invasion in military history. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on 5 Normandy beaches in Operation Overlord. The scale was staggering. 156,000 troops in the first wave, supported by nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft. But the invasion was not just about soldiers crossing a beach. It was about establishing an industrial pipeline that could sustain modern armies in combat thousands of miles from their production base. By the end of June 1944, Allied forces had unloaded 170,000 vehicles through the temporary Mulberry harbours and directly across the beaches. These artificial harbours, constructed in England and towed across the English Channel, represented engineering capabilities that German military planners considered impossible. The Mulberries were roughly the size of Dover Harbour, one of Britain's major ports, but they were temporary structures built specifically for this invasion and considered expendable. By late June, they had processed 7.5 million gallons of fuel and 500,000 tons of supplies. The German defenders watching this logistics operation unfold understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights photographed the artificial harbours and transmitted images back to Berlin. Intelligence analysts studied the photographs with growing alarm. The Americans and British had built functional ports from scratch in a matter of weeks, and these improvised harbours were handling more tonnage than many established European ports. This was American industrial capacity translated directly into military capability, the ability to create infrastructure where none existed simply by bringing it with them. But the invasion itself, while massive, represented only the beginning of the logistics challenge. The real test came when Allied forces finally broke out of the Normandy beachhead and began advancing across France at speeds that outran every pre-invasion planning assumption. The breakout from Normandy's bocage country proved far more difficult than Allied planners had anticipated. For 7 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces remained confined to a beachhead only 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. German defenders exploited the defensive advantages of Norman hedgerows, ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that divided the countryside into countless small fields. Each hedgerow became a prepared defensive position. Each field became a small battlefield. The fighting devolved into a grinding battle of attrition that threatened to replicate the static warfare of the First World War. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, finally shattered German defensive lines west of Saint-Lô. Following massive carpet bombing by Allied air forces that dropped over 4,000 tons of explosives in a concentrated area, American infantry and armoured units burst through German positions and swept into open French countryside. What followed shocked even Allied commanders with its speed and scope. General George Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1st and immediately began rapid advances that would characterize the pursuit across France. Within weeks, Patton's forces were advancing 50 to 75 miles per week, sometimes covering 80 miles in a single week during peak operations. By mid-August, elements of Third Army had reached the Seine River, over 150 miles from the Normandy beaches. Paris was liberated on August 25th. American and Free French forces rolled into a city that had been under German occupation for over 4 years. This operational success, this rapid advance that seemed to vindicate all Allied planning, created an unprecedented logistics crisis that threatened to halt the entire offensive and give German forces time to establish new defensive lines. The fundamental problem was simple. American armies were advancing faster than their supply system could keep pace. The Allied bombing campaign that had isolated Normandy from German reinforcements before D-Day had also destroyed much of France's rail infrastructure. Every bridge, every rail yard, every switching station that could move German troops toward Normandy had been systematically bombed. The French railway system lay in ruins, unable to move the massive quantities of supplies necessary to sustain rapidly advancing armies operating at modern mechanized warfare's full tempo. The scale of supply requirements for modern military operations exceeded anything from previous wars. Every division in combat required approximately 700 to 750 tons of supplies daily. This figure included ammunition for artillery, mortars, small arms, and anti-tank weapons. It included fuel for thousands of vehicles, from tanks and trucks to jeeps and motorcycles. It included food for 15,000 men, medical supplies, spare parts, replacement weapons, communications equipment, and hundreds of other categories of material that modern armies consumed continuously. By late August, 28 Allied divisions were advancing across France. The mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. Total daily requirements exceeded 20,000 tons. Patton's armoured divisions alone consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily during offensive operations. This fuel kept tanks moving, trucks rolling, reconnaissance vehicles patrolling, and command vehicles coordinating. Without it, the most powerful army in the world became immobile. The fundamental logistics problem involved distance and time. Each truck carrying supplies from Normandy to forward units had to make a round trip back to the beaches for another load. As the front advanced further east, round-trip times increased dramatically. A truck delivering supplies 200 miles from Normandy required over 50 hours for a complete cycle, including loading, driving, unloading, and returning. The same truck could make 2 deliveries per day when the front was only 50 miles distant. This meant that as the front advanced, the effective capacity of the supply system decreased. More trucks were needed simply to maintain the same delivery rate. But there was a finite number of trucks available, and they were all already committed to supply operations. The system was approaching its breaking point. By August 20th, 1944, American armies were experiencing critical shortages of fuel and ammunition that threatened to halt offensive operations entirely. Forward units were literally running out of gas within sight of retreating German forces. Tank battalions sat immobile, their engines silent, while German columns withdrew just beyond their reach. Artillery units rationed ammunition, unable to provide the massive fire support that had characterized earlier operations. The rapid advance that had characterized August was about to stop, not because of enemy resistance, but because supply trucks could not keep pace with the advance. This was precisely the pause that German defensive doctrine depended upon. German military planning throughout the war had assumed that attacking forces would eventually outrun their supply lines, creating vulnerable moments during resupply that defenders could exploit through counterattacks. For centuries, this principle had governed military operations. Armies advanced until their logistics stretched to breaking, then paused to resupply, and during that pause, they were vulnerable. The Americans were about to prove that principle obsolete. In a desperate 36-hour planning session beginning August 23rd, Transportation Corps officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force developed a solution that would become legendary in military logistics. They would create dedicated express routes using parallel one-way highways reserved exclusively for military supply traffic, operating continuously, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, until the crisis passed. The system would be called the Red Ball Express, a name borrowed from American railroad terminology. Beginning around 1892, the Santa Fe Railroad had marked priority freight cars containing perishable goods with red balls painted on their sides, giving these trains right-of-way over all other traffic. The term Red Ball became standard American railroad terminology for express shipping that could not be delayed. During preparations for D-Day, a logistics system in England had used the name Red Ball Express to rush supplies to southern ports for the invasion. Transportation Corps officers borrowed the name for their new operation, hoping it would achieve similar success. Colonel Loren Albert Ayers received command of organizing the operation. Known to subordinates as Little Patton for his aggressive leadership style and short stature, Ayers faced extraordinary challenges. He needed approximately 6,000 vehicles operating continuously. He needed 23,000 drivers working in two-man teams to maintain operations around the clock. He needed mechanics to maintain this fleet under field conditions. He needed traffic control personnel to manage continuous convoys. He needed route systems that could handle constant heavy traffic without creating gridlock or accidents that would shut down the entire operation. The trucks were readily available. General Motors had produced 562,000 CCKW trucks between 1941 and 1945, making the 2.5-ton GMC the second most numerous American military vehicle after the Jeep. These trucks, nicknamed Jimmy or Deuce and a Half by soldiers, featured six-wheel drive, GMC 270 cubic-inch six-cylinder engines producing 91 horsepower, and Warner 5-speed transmissions with overdrive. They could carry 2.5 tons off-road or 5 tons on improved highways. The CCKW's standardization represented a fundamental advantage over German logistics that German intelligence analysts would later document with alarm. Every American truck was identical, built to the same specifications using the same parts. Any mechanic could service any truck, any driver could operate any vehicle. Spare parts fit every truck in the fleet. This industrial standardization, taken for granted in American manufacturing, exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude. Germany had entered the Second World War with over 150 different truck models in military service, each requiring unique spare parts, specifically trained mechanics, and particular maintenance procedures. This fragmentation created continuous logistics nightmares. German units often had immobilized vehicles awaiting parts that would never arrive because manufacturers had gone out of business or switched production to military contracts. Finding compatible parts for repairs became a constant challenge that reduced operational availability and created administrative burdens that consumed enormous resources. The contrast exemplified a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached industrial production. American mass production emphasized standardization, interchangeable parts, and simplified maintenance, German manufacturing retained elements of craftsmanship, with each vehicle slightly different, requiring individual adjustment and specialized knowledge. German trucks were often better engineered, more sophisticated, more carefully finished. But in military logistics, where thousands of vehicles must be maintained under field conditions by soldiers with minimal training, American standardization proved decisively superior. Finding drivers proved more challenging than securing trucks. Ayers needed 23,000 men willing to drive continuously for extended periods under demanding conditions. The Army's solution reflected the racial realities of 1940s America that would cast a long shadow over an otherwise heroic story. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers would be African American soldiers. The American military in 1944 remained strictly segregated by official policy. Military leadership largely believed African Americans unsuitable for combat roles, relegating most black soldiers to service and support units, despite no evidence supporting this racist assumption. Quartermaster and Transportation Corps units were disproportionately staffed by African American enlisted men, performing the unglamorous but absolutely essential work of moving supplies. These soldiers, denied combat roles not because of ability but because of skin color, would prove their capabilities under conditions as demanding as any faced by frontline troops. Most Red Ball drivers were under 24 years old. Many had never driven trucks before military service. They came from every region of America, from urban neighborhoods to rural farms, from industrial cities to agricultural communities. They were united by determination to contribute to victory despite facing discrimination at home and within the military itself. The irony was profound and bitter. Young black men fighting for freedom abroad while denied full citizenship rights at home. Soldiers risking their lives for a nation that maintained segregation and discrimination as official policy. Men proving their courage and competence while military leadership continued believing racist mythology about their capabilities. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations. 67 truck companies commanding 3,558 trucks moved 4,482 tons of supplies on the first day. The initial route ran from Saint-Lô to Chartres, approximately 125 miles. Within 4 days, operations had expanded to 132 truck companies, operating 5,958 vehicles. The system created a continuous loop of traffic, unlike anything attempted in military logistics history. 2 parallel highways were commandeered between Normandy and forward supply depots. The northern route carried loaded trucks eastward toward the front. The southern route brought empty vehicles back to Normandy for reloading. All civilian traffic was prohibited. Military vehicles not part of Red Ball convoys could not use these dedicated routes. Every resource was concentrated on maintaining maximum flow of supplies to the advancing armies. Traffic control points operated continuously at every major intersection. Military police from the 793rd Military Police Battalion recorded convoy movements, provided directions, ensured priority access, and maintained operational discipline. The 793rd's distinctive unit insignia featured 2 red balls on a diagonal yellow line against a green background, commemorating their Red Ball service for decades after the war ended. Every truck displayed red balls painted on both sides and the front radiator grille. Additional markings indicated the truck's position in its convoy, parent unit, and cargo type. These visual identification systems allowed controllers to manage traffic, flow and identify problems quickly without stopping convoys for inspection that would slow operations. The operational requirements were extraordinarily demanding. Official regulations called for convoys of 5 or more trucks traveling 60 feet apart at 25 miles per hour, escorted by jeeps in front and rear. Trucks were supposed to stop for 10-minute rest breaks every hour. Night driving used cat-eye blackout lights that provided minimal illumination while reducing visibility to enemy aircraft. In practice, these regulations were frequently ignored out of operational necessity and driver determination. Individual trucks often departed Cherbourg immediately after loading rather than waiting for full convoys to form. Every minute saved meant supplies reached the front faster. Drivers disabled engine governors that limited top speed to 45 miles per hour, routinely exceeding 60 miles per hour on straightaways when road conditions permitted. Rest breaks were skipped when drivers felt capable of continuing. The mission's urgency overrode safety regulations as drivers pushed themselves and their vehicles to maintain supply flow. The round trip from Cherbourg to Chartres and back covered approximately 250 miles and officially required 54 hours. Drivers worked in two-man teams, alternating between driving and sleeping in the truck cab while their partner drove. In theory, each driver got adequate rest. In reality, road conditions, mechanical breakdowns, and operational pressures meant drivers often went days with minimal sleep, sustained by coffee, cigarettes, and determination. Private James Ruckard, a 19-year-old driver from Maple Heights, Ohio, later described the experience in interviews preserved by the Veterans History Project. There were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after bombs dropped. I was scared, but I did my job hoping for the best. Being young and about 4,000 miles away from home, anybody would be scared. The physical demands were relentless and unforgiving. Roads damaged by combat and weather created brutal driving conditions. Hitting potholes at high speed threw drivers against cab ceilings hard enough to cause injuries. Tire failures occurred constantly, requiring roadside changes under pressure to catch up with convoys that could not wait. Mud became the most persistent operational challenge, turning unpaved sections into quagmires that bogged vehicles and slowed entire convoys to crawling speeds. Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company later recalled the discrimination that persisted even during this critical operation. "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." One veteran remembered an incident where an African-American unit attempted to pass a white convoy. White drivers whipped their trucks into the center of the roadway to prevent black drivers from passing, creating a dangerous game of chicken on roads where speed was essential for mission success. Yet despite discrimination, exhaustion, and danger, Red Ball drivers maintained operations that kept Allied armies advancing when conventional logistics wisdom said supply chains must fail. On August 29, 1944, the system reached peak capacity. 5,938 vehicles delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. This represented more tonnage than Germany's entire logistics system in France could move through all methods combined truck, rail, and horse-drawn transport on their best day. The scale of this achievement becomes clear through comparison with German capabilities and historical logistics operations. At any given moment during Red Ball operations, approximately 900 trucks were on the road simultaneously. 2,000 trucks moved loaded toward the front. 2,000 returned empty to Normandy. The remainder underwent loading, unloading, refueling, or maintenance. The system processed over 6,000 vehicle movements daily, while maintaining continuous operations without pause. Sustaining the Red Ball Express itself required massive resources that consumed significant portions of the very supplies being transported. 6,000 trucks consumed approximately 2 million gallons of gasoline monthly just to operate, separate from the millions of gallons they transported to combat units. Tire wear from continuous operations at high speeds on damaged roads exhausted approximately 50,000 tires during the 83 days of peak operations. Maintenance requirements meant approximately 10% of the fleet was disabled for repairs at any given time, requiring mechanics to work around the clock performing field repairs under primitive conditions. The logistical infrastructure supporting the logistics operation involved establishing refueling points every 50 to 75 miles along the routes. Maintenance depots had to be positioned to respond quickly to breakdowns without creating traffic bottlenecks. Traffic control stations operated continuously at every intersection and major town. Spare parts had to be distributed to maintenance points. All of this meta-logistics functioned smoothly, while the primary mission of moving supplies to combat units continued without interruption. For German forces attempting to defend against the Allied advance, American logistics created insurmountable problems that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Traditional German defensive doctrine, developed over centuries of European warfare and refined through experience in 2 world wars, assumed that attacking forces would eventually outrun their supply lines. This created vulnerable pauses during resupply that defenders could exploit through carefully timed counterattacks. These pauses were not just probable, they were considered inevitable based on every historical precedent. No army in history had sustained rapid advances without periodic halts for resupply. American logistics eliminated these opportunities entirely. The Red Ball Express and the broader logistics system it represented meant that American forces could advance continuously without the predictable pauses that German doctrine depended upon for defensive success. German military logistics in 1944 relied heavily on horse-drawn transport in a way that shocked American intelligence officers who captured German supply columns. Germany had entered the war with approximately 2,750,000 horses, and Wehrmacht dependence on horses actually increased as the war progressed. Motor vehicle losses exceeded industrial replacement capacity, forcing German divisions to rely more heavily on horse-drawn wagons for supply transportation. Even as Allied forces became increasingly motorized, a typical German infantry division in France during 1944 included approximately 50 motorized vehicles and 1,500 horse-drawn wagons, pulled by 4,000 to 6,000 horses. These animals were not ceremonial or traditional. They were essential operational equipment that required constant care and consumed enormous resources. Each horse required 12 pounds of oats and 15 pounds of hay daily, plus constant access to water. In offensive operations, horses could move approximately 15 to 20 miles per day before requiring rest. The logistics of feeding horses consumed enormous resources that could otherwise support combat operations. Every ton of fodder transported to feed horses was a ton unavailable for ammunition or fuel. German supply columns, consisting of 40 horse-drawn wagons and a dozen trucks of various makes, could move approximately 40 tons of supplies 20 kilometers forward on good roads under ideal conditions. This required feeding 160 horses and maintaining trucks with no common spare parts, because Germany's fragmented industrial base produced dozens of different truck models, each requiring unique maintenance expertise and specialized parts. By comparison, a single Red Ball convoy of 50 trucks could move 125 tons of supplies 200 kilometers in the same time period. This wasn't a marginal advantage. This was more than a 1-0-to-1 advantage in logistics capacity that gave American forces operational capabilities. German commanders simply could not match or counter through any tactical calls. Innovation. German attempts to interdict Red Ball operations achieved minimal success despite their best efforts and increasing desperation. Luftwaffe attacks, once feared as the primary threat to convoy operations during the planning phase, proved almost completely ineffective as German air power collapsed under sustained Allied fighter superiority. By September 1944, Luftwaffe sorties over France had become so rare that Red Ball convoys operated without fighter escort and suffered negligible losses to air attack. The German Air Force that had terrorized Europe in 1940 through 1942 had been bled white through attrition over multiple fronts. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Training programs could not replace losses quickly enough. Fuel shortages, limited flight hours, and training quality. Aircraft production, while still substantial, could not keep pace with losses. Most significantly, Allied air superiority was so complete that German aircraft faced overwhelming odds whenever they attempted operations over France. Ground interdiction attempts proved equally futile and costly for German forces. German units that attempted to ambush supply convoys discovered that American logistics troops fought effectively when attacked, contrary to assumptions that rear-area soldiers would panic and flee when engaged by combat troops. Red Ball drivers carried personal weapons and returned fire when attacked. Military police escorts engaged attackers with automatic weapons and called in rapid reaction forces that arrived with overwhelming firepower within minutes. The few successful ambushes convinced German commanders that attacking supply columns risked casualties disproportionate to any possible gain. Destroying a few trucks accomplished nothing when hundreds more followed behind them. The Americans simply absorbed losses and continued operations without pause. Meanwhile, German forces that revealed their positions by attacking convoys faced immediate retaliation from tactical air support or rapid reaction ground forces. The primary threats to Red Ball operations came from operational factors rather than enemy action. Driver exhaustion caused accidents that killed or injured personnel and destroyed vehicles at rates that concerned commanders but never threatened overall operations. One veteran described seeing exhausted drivers fall asleep at the wheel and crash into ditches or other vehicles, sometimes with fatal consequences. Mechanical breakdowns temporarily reduced available trucks until maintenance teams completed repairs. Road damage from weather and continuous heavy traffic required ongoing repair efforts to keep routes passable. Despite these challenges, Red Ball Express delivered between 412,000 and 420,000 tons of supplies between August 25 and November 16, 1944. Historical sources vary slightly on the exact total due to incomplete record-keeping under operational pressures, but all sources agree the figure exceeded 400,000 tons. This represented over 1 million individual truckloads moved an average distance of 250 miles, through weather challenges, mechanical problems, and operational demands that would have broken less resilient logistics systems. To put this in perspective, 412,000 tons represented complete supply requirements for 30 divisions for 2 weeks of intensive combat operations. The operational scope expanded well beyond the original route as Allied forces advanced and logistics requirements evolved. By September, multiple express routes operated across France, each with distinctive markings, but following the same operational principles established by the original Red Ball. The White Ball Express operated from Le Havre and Rouen to Paris, starting in early October after those ports became operational. The Little Red Ball carried priority supplies from Normandy to Paris on a shorter, more direct route. The Green Diamond Express moved supplies from Normandy to railheads 100 miles inland, where French rail lines had been repaired sufficiently to resume operations. The Red Lion Express supplied British 21st Army Group in Belgium, demonstrating that American logistics innovation benefited all Allied forces. The ABC Express route connected Antwerp to depots 90 miles inland after that crucial port opened in late November, finally providing the deep water port facility that Allied logistics had desperately needed since the invasion. These interconnected routes created a transportation network operating independently of rail infrastructure, providing flexibility that traditional logistics could not match. When German counterattacks disrupted rail lines, truck convoys rerouted within hours. When ports became congested, supplies shifted to alternate routes seamlessly. The American logistics system demonstrated resilience through redundancy and adaptability that German planners had not believed possible. The Red Ball Express officially ended operations on November 16, 1944. By that date, French rail lines had been sufficiently repaired to resume moving supplies at scales that could supplement truck transport. More significantly, the port of Antwerp in Belgium had been captured intact on September 4 and fully opened to shipping by late November, after Allied forces cleared German positions from the Scheldt estuary. Antwerp's deep-water port facilities could handle far more tonnage than the Normandy beaches and Mulberry harbours combined, dramatically shortening supply lines to forward units. Ships could unload directly at Antwerp docks rather than across beaches. Supplies moved by rail or truck only 90 miles to forward depots instead of 250 miles from Normandy. The logistics situation that had created the crisis in August had fundamentally changed by November. As Red Ball operations wound down, tonnage delivered decreased accordingly. From the peak of 12,342 tons on August 29, daily deliveries settled to approximately 5,000 tons through October, then declined to around 2,700 tons daily in early November. By mid-November, only 5 truck companies remained on Red Ball routes compared to 132 at peak operations in early September. The cost of this achievement was measured in exhausted personnel and worn-out equipment. Maintenance records indicate that Red Ball trucks required major repairs approximately every 30 days of continuous operations. The extreme operational tempo wore out mechanical components far faster than normal usage patterns. Transmissions failed, engines required rebuilding, axles broke, suspension components wore out. The punishment these vehicles endured exceeded anything they had been designed for. Personnel casualties from accidents, exhaustion, and the few enemy encounters totaled several hundred, though exact figures remain unclear due to incomplete record-keeping under operational pressures. Drivers died in accidents caused by exhaustion, mechanical failures, or dangerous road conditions. Others suffered injuries that ended their service. Some were killed or wounded in the few successful German attacks on convoys. Yet this cost was minimal compared to strategic value delivered. Red Ball Express enabled Allied forces to maintain pressure on retreating German armies at precisely the moment when sustained pursuit might have ended the war in 1944. Although fuel shortages eventually forced operational pauses in September, the sustained offensive from August through early October inflicted irreplaceable losses on German forces and brought Allied armies to Germany's frontier. Military historians continue debating whether different logistics priorities might have enabled Allied forces to breach Germany's West Wall defences in autumn 1944, potentially ending the war before winter. These counterfactual discussions often centre on fuel allocation decisions, with some arguing that concentrating resources on a single thrust, either Field Marshal Montgomery's northern route through the Netherlands or Patton's southern advance through Lorraine, might have achieved the breakthrough that the broad front strategy prevented. These debates, while intellectually fascinating, sometimes overlook the fundamental achievement Red Ball represented. The system delivered sufficient supplies to support simultaneous offensives across a 400-kilometre front while maintaining operational flexibility that allowed rapid response to changing tactical situations. No previous army in military history had sustained such operational tempo at such distances from secure supply bases using only road transport. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The racial composition of Red Ball units reflected America's segregated military, while simultaneously undermining the racist assumptions that had created segregation in the first place. African American soldiers served their nation despite facing discrimination at home and within the military structure. Their performance on the Red Ball Express demonstrated capabilities that racial prejudice claimed they lacked. 3/4 of Red Ball drivers were black soldiers who had been assigned to non-combat service units not because of ability, but because military leadership in 1944 maintained racial restrictions on combat roles based on nothing more than bigotry and ignorance. These men proved their courage, competence, and dedication. Under conditions as demanding as any faced by combat troops, they drove through enemy territory where German forces still operated. They operated under fire when German units attempted interdiction. They maintained operational discipline, despite exhaustion that would have broken less determined individuals. They performed their duties with professionalism and effectiveness that contradicted every racist assumption about their capabilities. General George Patton, despite his own well-documented racial prejudices, acknowledged Red Ball's essential contribution to his army's advance. He stated that the 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon. Coming from a general who commanded armoured divisions with hundreds of tanks, this assessment spoke volumes about logistics' importance in modern warfare. Colonel John Eisenhower, son of Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, argued that, without Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. This was not hyperbole or diplomatic courtesy, it was simple recognition of operational reality. The trucks and their drivers were as essential to victory as the infantry who seized ground or the tankers who broke through German defences. After the war, African-American Red Ball drivers returned to a segregated America, where many faced continued discrimination despite their service. They returned to communities where they could not eat in the same restaurants as white soldiers, could not attend the same schools, could not vote in many jurisdictions, faced employment discrimination and housing discrimination. Yet their achievement contributed to growing pressure for military integration. The performance of black soldiers in logistics roles and in the combat positions, some eventually held during the Battle of the Bulge, when manpower shortages forced partial integration, helped demonstrate the absurdity and harm of racial segregation. President Harry Truman's 1948 executive order, integrating the armed forces, drew partly on evidence that racial segregation harmed military effectiveness by preventing optimal use of available personnel. The Red Ball Express became part of the historical record that proved African American soldiers could perform any military duty with distinction when given the opportunity. Red Ball drivers recognized the contradiction at the time. They were serving a nation that denied them full citizenship rights, delivering supplies to armies fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. The Double V campaign, promoted by black newspapers during the war victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, resonated with Red Ball soldiers who embodied this dual struggle. Washington Rector, who served with the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company, later reflected on this experience. "We knew we were as good as anybody else. We proved it every day on those roads. We just wanted the chance to show what we could do." That chance came through the Red Ball Express, and the drivers seized it, performing under impossible conditions and proving their worth beyond any reasonable doubt. In September 1985, 41 years after operations began, surviving Red Ball drivers held a reunion in Alexandria, Virginia. Over 500 former drivers attended, bringing families to share memories of their service. Former Corporal Charles Johnson, who had served with the 783rd Military Police Battalion directing Red Ball traffic, spoke at the reunion about the significance of their contribution. The drivers had moved over 400,000 tons of supplies in 83 days, keeping armies advancing when conventional logistics wisdom said supply chains must fail. They had done this despite exhaustion, despite discrimination, despite danger, because soldiers at the front needed what they carried. Their achievement deserved recognition equal to any combat unit. The operational lessons from Red Ball influenced American military logistics for decades after the war ended. Similar dedicated supply routes appeared during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, though on smaller scale appropriate to that conflict's geography. Vietnam logistics adapted Red Ball principles to Southeast Asian conditions, with routes like Highway 19 becoming crucial supply arteries despite constant enemy interdiction attempts. Desert Storm planners in 1991 studied Red Ball operations when developing supply systems for the liberation of Kuwait. The ability to sustain high operational tempo through superior logistics became a defining characteristic of American military doctrine. Modern American military doctrine emphasizes logistics flexibility, redundancy, and capacity to sustain high operational tempo through superior supply chain management. These principles trace directly to lessons learned during Red Ball Express and the broader logistics achievements that sustained Allied operations in the Second World War. The concept of theater sustainment command structures, centralized logistics planning, and joint logistics operations all evolved from wartime experiences, including Red Ball. Military logistics is now recognized as equally important as combat operations, deserving of the same professional attention and advanced training. General Dwight Eisenhower, reflecting on the war after serving as Supreme Allied Commander, included the 2.5-ton truck on his list of 6 most vital weapons that won the war in Europe. The other 5 were the Dakota C-47 transport aircraft, the Jeep, the bazooka, the atomic bomb, and the bulldozer. This assessment from the commander, who had access to every weapons system in the Allied arsenal, underscores the strategic importance of logistics in modern warfare. The statistics of Red Ball operations remain impressive by any standard. 83 days of continuous operations delivering an average of 5,000 tons daily represents sustained and logistics performance that equals or exceeds many modern military supply chains. The system moved approximately 412,000 tons total, equivalent to complete supply requirements for 30 divisions for 2 weeks of intensive operations, using only trucks and roads without rail support. The GMC CCKW trucks that formed Red Ball's backbone continued service long after the war ended. The United States military retained CCKWs into the 1960s, testament to their durability and reliability. Surplus vehicles were sold or given to Allied nations worldwide, where they served into the 1990s in some cases. The basic design influenced post-war American truck development, establishing standards that persist in modern military vehicles like the M35 series that replaced the CCKW. Red Ball demonstrated that in modern mechanized warfare, logistics capacity determines operational possibility. Armies can only sustain operations at the tempo and scale their supply systems support. Combat effectiveness means nothing if ammunition runs out, fuel exhausts, or food supplies fail. The Germans understood this principle intellectually, but could not match American implementation practically. The Americans understood this principle and built logistics systems capable of sustaining unlimited operational tempo within the constraints of available resources and infrastructure. Combat effectiveness was maintained because supplies never failed. American forces delivered more supplies than combat units could use, creating redundancy that ensured operations never stopped for want of material. German forces failed to grasp how thoroughly American logistics would dominate the campaign until it was too late to develop effective responses. Wehrmacht logistics officers who became prisoners of war and were interrogated about German supply challenges uniformly expressed shock at American logistics capacity. They had studied American industrial production, they knew American capacity exceeded German output, but they had assumed distances involved in transporting supplies across the Atlantic and then inland through France would create exploitable vulnerabilities. Instead, they discovered American logistics had no breaking point they could find. American forces delivered more supplies than combat units could use, an abundance that seemed wasteful by German standards, but represented insurance against disruption. Ammunition expenditure exceeded anything German forces had witnessed. Artillery batteries fired preparatory barrages, consuming tonnages that would have exhausted German stocks in hours. Tank units advanced without the fuel pauses German doctrine assumed were inevitable. Infantry attacks featured supporting fires that German forces could not match because they lacked ammunition. This American capacity for sustained operations without logistics pauses fundamentally changed defensive planning for German forces. Every German defensive doctrine assumed attacking forces would eventually pause to resupply, creating counterattack opportunities. American logistics eliminated these opportunities entirely. Red Ball convoys ensured ammunition and fuel reached forward units faster than combat operations could deplete stockpiles. The December 1944 Battle of the Bulge represented Germany's final attempt to exploit what Hitler believed was American logistics vulnerability. The Ardennes counteroffensive aimed to reach Antwerp, splitting Allied armies and capturing the port that sustained American operations. Hitler calculated that deep penetration into Allied rear areas would sever supply lines and create crises forcing negotiations. The plan failed partly because of determined American defensive stands at Bastogne, Saint-Vith and Elsenborn Ridge, where American infantry and armor held critical positions despite being surrounded or heavily outnumbered. But ultimately the offensive failed because German logistics could not sustain it beyond the first few days. German panzer divisions began operations with fuel for only 150 kilometers of advance. Hitler's planning assumed captured American fuel dumps would supply advancing German units, an assumption based more on wishful thinking than realistic assessment. This dependency on capturing enemy supplies was itself an admission of German logistical weakness and strategic desperation. Red Ball Express drivers, along with other Transportation Corps units, raced through Belgium, evacuating fuel dumps ahead of the German advance. Thousands of gallons of gasoline and tons of ammunition were moved beyond German reach in operations conducted under chaotic conditions as American forces struggled to contain the breakthrough. These drivers demonstrated courage and effectiveness equal to combat troops, ensuring German forces found empty dumps rather than the supplies needed to sustain their offensive. By December 19th, 5 days into the offensive, major German panzer formations reported critical fuel shortages that immobilized entire divisions. The 2nd SS Panzer Division halted after crossing the Aue River, immobilized by empty fuel tanks within sight of objectives. The 1st SS Panzer Division abandoned dozens of vehicles after exhausting fuel supplies, their advance ending not through American resistance but through logistics failure. German ammunition shortages developed almost immediately despite careful stockpiling before the offensive. Artillery units conducting preparatory fires exhausted stocks within days. Resupply failed because German horse-drawn supply columns could not navigate icy Belgian roads at speeds necessary to keep pace with advancing units. The few motorized supply units Germany retained lacked sufficient fuel to operate effectively. In contrast, American logistics responded to the Bulge crisis with speed that stabilized defensive positions within 48 hours. Despite losing important supply dumps in the initial breakthrough, American forces re-established supply lines faster than German forces could exploit disruption. Artillery units defending key positions fired without restrictions, expending ammunition at rates that would have exhausted German stocks immediately. The Battle of the Bulge proved to be the final demonstration of the logistics differential that had shaped the Western Front since Normandy. American forces could sustain unlimited material expenditure within the constraints of available transport. German forces operated on starvation logistics that made sustained operations impossible. Once American logistics began flowing to defensive positions, the outcome was never truly in doubt. Red Ball Express represented one element of American military logistics that collectively delivered over 7 million tons of supplies to European theater forces between June 1944 and May 1945. This tonnage sustained 85 American divisions plus supporting corps and army troops. It enabled unlimited ammunition expenditure that broke German defensive lines through sheer weight of firepower. It maintained fuel supplies for mechanized advances that outran German retreat capabilities. It provided logistical security that allowed American commanders to fight without worrying that supply failures would compromise operations. The German Wehrmacht never recovered from losses sustained during the pursuit across France. Divisions shattered in Normandy and destroyed during the retreat to Germany were never adequately rebuilt. Equipment losses exceeded industrial replacement capacity, even after Albert Speer's rationalization of production. Manpower casualties could not be replaced with soldiers of equivalent quality as the Reich's manpower pool was exhausted. Most significantly, logistics deficiencies that had hampered German operations throughout the war became insurmountable, as Allied air superiority destroyed rail networks and fuel shortages immobilized remaining motor transport. Germany's horse-drawn logistics system, obsolete when the war began, proved completely inadequate for modern mechanized warfare against an enemy operating at industrial scale. The approximately 3 million horses Germany employed during the Second World War represented a logistics nightmare that consumed resources, limited operational tempo, and created vulnerabilities that American mechanization ruthlessly exploited. Every ton of fodder transported to feed horses was a ton unavailable for ammunition or fuel. Every unit delayed while waiting for horses to rest was a unit unable to respond to fast-moving mechanized attacks. The contrast between American trucks and German horses epitomized the fundamental industrial disparity that decided the war. American factories produced standardized vehicles in quantities that seemed impossible to German planners. German industry struggled to maintain production of diverse vehicle models using increasingly scarce resources and forced labor that could not match free workers' productivity or innovation. When the war ended in May 1945, American forces in Europe operated the most sophisticated logistics system ever developed to that point in military history. This system had sustained the largest amphibious invasion in history, supported the fastest sustained advance in modern military operations, overcome setbacks during the Bulge offensive, and delivered Allied armies to the Elbe River on schedule. Red Ball Express had been one component of this system, operational for only 83 days out of the 11 months from D-Day to victory, but its symbolic importance exceeded its operational tonnage. Those trucks rolling through France in autumn 1944, marked with red balls and driven by exhausted soldiers pushing through one more run, represented everything that made Allied victory inevitable. They demonstrated American industrial capacity, translated into military power. They proved logistics could win wars as surely as battles. They showed that determination and organization could overcome any obstacle when supported by sufficient resources and intelligent planning. The Red Ball Express was the visible symbol of American logistics dominance, rolling through France in endless columns that could be counted but not stopped by any action German forces could take. Those young drivers, many of them African-American soldiers facing discrimination while serving their nation, proved more valuable to victory than anyone had anticipated when the operation began. They kept armies moving when logistics should have forced pauses, according to all historical precedent. They delivered ammunition, enabling unlimited fire support that broke German defensive positions. They hauled fuel, sustaining mechanized advances that prevented German forces from establishing new defensive lines. They moved supplies, feeding soldiers, and maintaining equipment that kept the entire military machine functioning. In doing so, they won the war as surely as infantry who stormed Omaha Beach, tankers who broke through at Saint-Lô, or airborne soldiers who held Bastogne against impossible odds. Red Ball Express demonstrated that in modern warfare, supply sergeants win battles as much as combat commanders. The logistics sustaining operations determined what was operationally possible. American truck drivers delivering thousands of tons daily through French countryside proved more decisive than elite German formations, lacking fuel to reach objectives. This was the lesson that the evidence of American logistics demonstrated with mathematical certainty. This was the reality that shattered German assumptions about American industrial weakness. This was the truth that Germany's leaders failed to grasp when they challenged the world's greatest industrial power to total war. American trucks rolling through France carried not just supplies, but proof of a fundamental principle that would reshape military thinking for generations. Industrial capacity wins modern wars between industrial nations, and America possessed industrial capacity on a scale Germany could never match, even at peak mobilization. Red Ball Express operated for 83 days. In that period, it delivered approximately 412,000 tons of supplies, wore out 50,000 tires, exhausted thousands of young drivers who pushed themselves beyond reasonable limits because soldiers at the front needed what they carried, and fundamentally changed how military logistics would be understood and implemented for decades to come. Those 83 days changed military logistics forever and helped end the Second World War in Europe by ensuring Allied armies never slowed for want of supplies. The American military never imagined before the war that it would need to create such a system. The pre-war army was small, its logistics oriented toward limited operations, its planning conservative and traditional, but when necessity demanded innovation, American ingenuity, industrial capacity, and the dedication of thousands of soldiers created a logistics operation that became legendary. The Red Ball Express proved that modern military power depends as much on supply chains as firepower, that victories are won in factories and on supply roads as much as on battlefields, and that the soldiers who drive trucks deserve recognition equal to those who drive tanks. History remembers the dramatic moments, the landings at Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine, but behind every advance stood the unglamorous but essential work of logistics. The Red Ball Express, operating for less than 3 months in 1944, demonstrated that American industrial might extended far beyond weapons production to include the organizational capacity to deliver those weapons where and when they were needed most. That was America's true secret weapon in the Second World War. Not just the ability to produce more than any adversary, which America certainly did, but the capacity to deliver production to the point of need faster than enemies could respond or adapt. The Red Ball Express symbolized this advantage perfectly, trucks rolling through France day and night, delivering victory one load at a time, driven by young Americans who understood that their mission was as vital as any combat operation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.